Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second day of AI Policy Conference. And for those who are seeing us for the very first time, welcome. My name is Sanja Fabrio. I'm co-founder and managing director of RegHorizon. I will, together with my colleague, Ayisha Piotti, and Professor Elliott from ETH Zurich, be your host for the conference. Why are we here? And what is the motivation to do a conference on AI policy? As we know, all as users or as developers of the AI, artificial intelligence is a powerful tool, and it has enormous potentials to bring the good to the world. At the same time, AI is generating some major societal concerns that we all have as citizens, as parents, as business people, as scientists, whatever our background may be. So how can we reconcile the benefit and the risk that AI technologies pose? How we ensure that we can tap into the full potential of AI in a way that's going to be good for the economy and for the society? Only part of the answer, but a very important answer, or very important part, is regulation of AI. So regulation that upholds trust and trustworthiness of those who deploy AI solutions. So if we are to optimize the deployment of AI as safe, reliable, and accountable technologies, we need to balance the needs, interests, and challenges of many parties to the deployment, development, and indeed the use of AI. We need all of us to get involved. We also need to get involved and have our voice heard when building relevant and effective regulation. So this is what we at RegHorizon, together with our partners, and I hope many of you, we will be focusing in the months ahead. We will build on findings of this conference and setting up projects involving different stakeholders and also different expertise types to advance practically on some of the key suggestions this interactive conference on AI policy will bring. I am thrilled to see so many of you today with us. We had over 400 registrations, and that proves that this is a highly relevant topic. You are from all backgrounds and the geographies. So Arvin, if I can just ask you to show up the makeup of the registered participants. We have about an equal split of about 30% from business, from academia, and civil society, and about 10% or 12% from policymakers. But what is truly amazing is from where you all are coming from. We have this great map, so it's really global, and it really proves that this is a very relevant and a very timely topic to discuss. I truly look forward to discuss and build the future together with you on many projects that we will hopefully be working together. Now, as we progress through the program, please think about your specific needs, your experiences, challenges, and what expertise can you bring and can you contribute to these developments? Do let us know. We will be essentially putting our contact details in the chat. So it's connect@reghorizon.com. You can also go to our website and contact us during or before, after the conference. We had a very insightful discussion throughout yesterday afternoon. As a quick recap, we have covered the role of AI policy to uphold the trustworthiness of developers and deployers of AI while stimulating innovation and growth. We discussed data privacy and consumer protection and what is the right time to regulate competently. And also I heard from very inspiring Dr. Weinberger, who had a message to regulators himself as well. He was saying, be close and stay close technology to be able to understand the technology you regulate and ensure that you are inclusive of everybody's needs. Today, we will discuss the need and the steps to create and implement a cross-border coordinated global approach to AI policy. We will then zoom into a specific sector that we all have a very high stake in, a healthcare sector, to explore how can policy mitigate risk, ensure safety and performance of AI solutions so that it facilitates its deployment. And then we will go into more details on how to get ready, both as individuals and organizations, and indeed regulatory bodies, to manage business risk and complexity that AI brings as we build better augmented future for us all. We will also dive in a cutting-edge research in sessions hosted by ETH Zurich, which Elliott will explain in a moment. We would like this to be a very interactive conference, so please ensure you ask our panelists questions. Each panel is about an hour. It's mainly Q&A, so use the chat function for that. Use the chat function to ask the questions. Our chat moderators will then bring them to the panel. Our panelists have graciously agreed to stay for about 15 minutes during the coffee break after the panel with us. So you will have the option of joining us in a separate Zoom room and continue the interaction, hopefully asking the questions that we haven't been able to address during the main panel. We will also be asking you to give us your opinion about certain topics that we'll be covering. Arvin, actually, we can use the moment now to show the first one in relation to Geo Harmonization, the first panel that we'll be hearing about in a minute. So if we can just have a poll for a second. Thank you. So a few seconds to decide about a question. Do you think that we have stronger rules, having a stronger rules in Europe related to AI and to digital will put European companies at an economic disadvantage globally versus their American or Asian counterparts? Great. I think we will have an interesting topic to develop going forward. So before we dive in the first panel on Geo Harmonization with my colleague Ayisha Piotti, I will pass the word very quickly to Professor Elliott from ETH Zurich, our partner and co-host of AI Policy Conference. Elliott?
Thank you, Sanja, and thank you everyone for joining for the second day, and nice to see everyone again. My name is Elliott Ash. I chair the Law, Economics, and Data Science group at the Center for Law and Economics at ETH Zurich. We are an interdisciplinary research center working on law and economics for technology, AI, behavior, and policy. We use statistics, machine learning, and natural language processing tools to analyze these issues. As with yesterday, again, I am happy to announce a set of academic sessions where frontier research in AI policy will be presented. We have an international group of scholars presenting on human-AI interactions, AI fairness, regulation of algorithms, IP, and data protection. This afternoon, we will have short previews of this research for the main conference. And later in the evening, we have the more technical presentations and feedback sessions. All participants are welcome to join, both in the afternoon and in the evening. So, as we have already seen yesterday, there is an exciting conversation to be had across the public and the private sectors, as well as with academics. We are looking forward to continuing that today. So thanks again. And now I will turn it back to Ayisha Potts from RegHorizon, who will lead us into our first panel session.
Thank you very much, Elliott, and welcome everyone to this session on geo-harmonization of AI policy. So for those of you who are just joining us, a very warm welcome to you as well. Just to introduce myself, I'm Ayisha Piotti. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of RegHorizon, and I will be the host for this session now. So for those of you who were with us yesterday, we talked about the importance of policy to foster innovation and growth, and at the same time, the need to have clear rules to protect consumers, businesses, and citizens. However, as we all know, the digital world is more connected today than ever before, and this has implications for any rules that we will create. So the main objective for this session now is first to understand where we stand with regards to creating a coordinated approach to AI policy, and two, to look at exploring the best way forward. So I'm delighted to have a fantastic set of panelists with us today. I would like to mention that we have an equal gender split. I hope Eva is going to join if that's the case. And for that, I'm really proud. So I will not have the time to list all the accomplishments and full bios of our distinguished speakers, but I hope that you have a chance to look them up on the events page. I would anyways like to briefly introduce them to you now. I start with Robert Madelin, who is the international chairman of FIPRA. Robert has a long and distinguished career at the European Commission, including holding the positions of Director General for Communications, Network, Content and Technology, as well as Director General for Health and Consumer Policy. Welcome, Robert. It's an honor to have you with us today. Next up is Ivana Bartoletti, who is the founder of Women Leading in AI network based out of the UK. She's also the technical director of privacy at Deloitte. Ivana is an author and a strong advocate for digital ethics. Welcome, Ivana. Eva Kaili, who is a member of the European Parliament and also the chair of the Future of Science and Technology panel at the European Union, the European Parliament. Eva is a driving force on parliamentary discussions on digital technologies within Europe. And lastly, we have David Campos, who is Chief Group Data Privacy Officer, General Counsel, and Vice President at Nestlé. I must add here that it was after a few discussions with David about the challenges and opportunities of AI use in a large multinational such as Nestlé that we decided also to organize this session. So thank you so much, David, for joining us, and it's a real pleasure to have you here. So how are we going to proceed? I think Sanja already talked about it, but I think it's worth maybe mentioning one more time. The panel discussion is going to last for 1 hour. It will be Q&A based. You also have the chance to interact with our panelists after the main session for 15 minutes during the break. And of course, we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. This means that please do post your questions in the chat, and our chat moderators will help us bring it into the debate later on. So before we kick off, I actually wanted to start the ball rolling with another poll. And Arvin, if you could just roll that poll now to warm us up. So the question is global harmonization of rules related to artificial intelligence important? Very important? It's somewhat important? It's not so important? And it's not important at all? So, interesting. So we can end it now, I suppose. So obviously, it looks like it's very important. With that in mind, I would like to ask my first question to David. So do we really need to harmonize rules across borders? And if so, why should that be the case?
I think that the answer is yes. And I think that for two reasons. First, because the balkanization of the regulation may be an important inhibitor, for the innovation. So if we don't have a clear legal landscape for those companies who are investing in developing artificial intelligence, and for those companies that are investing in the adoption of artificial intelligence, well, this is going to be, or maybe one of the key inhibitors. It's also important as well to be sure that people are committed, and companies are committed with the ethical principles, with this kind of regulations, because if we don't have a clear landscape, that where companies like Nestlé can operate, then we will consider, twice if this is the right technology for us to invest, or if Europe is the right place for us to invest versus other jurisdictions where the regulation is more clear for us.
Okay, interesting. So it is important, and we hear why. I'd like to take it now a little bit more macro, and I would like to ask my next question to Robert. Robert, we also heard yesterday a lot about the need for regulators to be faster, more efficient, with policy in AI. But on the other hand, there were these concerns that, if you go too fast, you cause too many problems as well. And then not many people are happy with that either. So generally, the question really is, you have, of course, a vast experience in policymaking. In your view, what are the key elements of a successful AI policy? essentially, what do the businesses need to do? What do the regulators need to do? And one thing which is always coming up is, how do we start? Do we start, from small and build it up? Or do we start with a global policy and then, adopt it locally? So I'd love to hear your views on that, Robert.
So I think it's a great question. In the AI space, I think one of the leading exponents of responsible AI is actually Fujitsu. But interestingly, I believe they developed their approach out of the UK and Europe and fed it back to headquarters. So I think that's a very important example that one of the reasons to do things globally is you scale and learn faster. If you're present in all markets, then as a company, you will be moving faster than the regulator to create good things. But to answer more directly your own question, I think there are three parallel tracks to ensure speed. The first is mutual recognition. We need to be operating in an ethic of mutual recognition between regulators so that as far as possible, we are accepting each other's standards as being a good first step, even as we are improving them together. We are accepting each other's approval processes as a good first step. So mutual recognition. Secondly, where we can't just recognize somebody else, we should at least be talking to them. So networks of excellence, both for AI innovators, I think of IEEE or something like that, and for regulators. And thirdly, but only thirdly, thinking about the progressive substantive alignment of our standards. Because too often we go to the substance first, and then we waste a lot of time. And actually creating networks of excellence and mutual recognition, mutual trust machine is much more important than deciding a global standard for what AI should do.
Very well. And in terms of, the approach, should it be sort of, all individual countries working on that, or should it be sort of, the international multilateral institutions working on that and pushing it downwards?
Well, in practice, I think there as well, you see that international institutions and other actors are part of a single network. Mm-hmm. It's not a pure Westphalian and UN structure. The UN layer, the international layer, the national layer, it all fits together in a single structure. And I think that the importance is rather the quality of the output. So a body such as UNESCO has put out strong ideas. A body such as IEEE, which is a private body, has put out strong ideas. I would like to think that the AI initiatives coming out of Brussels have been strong ideas. They all contribute, and people are in practice reading each other's notes, whether or not they are similar institutional entities.
Very good. So I like this idea of, focusing on the quality of output. My next question is more to Ivana. Yesterday we had a keynote speech from Dr. David Weinberger from Harvard, and he sort of highlighted that AI really is pushing policymakers to become more concrete with regards to what we mean by justice, what do we mean by fairness, because essentially all these concepts are quite difficult to define, and they're very much, a function of, our culture, our values, and they can also be very relative. So the question really for you, Ivana, is, of course, when we look at global AI policy, are there sort of some universal values that should be forming the basis of that? And essentially knowing already that there are differences between cultures and different parts of the world think differently, even if we take, for example, the privacy as one thing, what should be the way we should go forward on that?
So thank you, and what a fantastic question to start with. I wanted to say just on this, just a couple of things. First is, following on to what Robert was saying just now, I think it's really important to stress that AI does not exist in isolation. And we already have so much that governs the output, the development, and the deployment of artificial intelligence. So we do have already legislation around anti-discrimination, We do already have international tools for human rights. We do already have legislation about equal opportunities across countries and legislation and jurisprudence. That's the first point that we need to make, I think. Whether this legislation is sufficient or not to govern some of the potential harms that are new and they come from the deployment of AI, and in particular, automated decision-making, that's a different set of questions. So I think the first point, and this is where we need to learn from each other at global level, is whether we can perform a fitness test of existing legislation to see whether it's able to protect individuals, and especially from an intersectional perspective, from the harms that can be caused by an unfettered use of AI. That's my second point. The third point around cultures is that what we are seeing at the moment is that although there are so many differences at global level, what we are seeing, for example, what you just said, Ayisha, around privacy, what we're seeing is that although it's very different and privacy does evolve and does change, and changes with technology and changes with cultures and change with the development of new digital products, what we're seeing, for example, across the world is that privacy is becoming crucial everywhere. We've seen it in the EU, but actually what we are seeing is a new legislation and framework which is up for discussion in China at the moment around privacy. We've seen it in the US, we've seen it in Brazil. So we're all different at sort of nuances, obviously, but what we are seeing is that there is an alignment around particular concept, and one is privacy, the other one is fairness, the other one is trustworthy. Just these this concept, although with differences, but they seem to be replicated across the globe when it comes to governing artificial intelligence. And the last thing that I really want to say is, yes, your speaker was right yesterday in saying that, you know, people are becoming, and legislators are becoming more practical when it comes to, for example, fairness. But one thing that we must not confuse is, one thing is fairness in AI and algorithmic fairness, for example. One thing is fairness in terms of societal values. You know, algorithmic fairness is very different from justice, and we shouldn't ever, I think, confuse these two levels.
Right. Very interesting. Now, you talked about the concept of fitness test for existing legislation. So I'm going to bring in Eva over here. Glad to have you on board, Eva. And you know, we know that the European, Commission is doing quite a little bit of work on this topic now, and as well as the Parliament. Specifically, we've seen quite a few things coming up in the last year or two. So, given that our audience is very global, I'd really like to ask you to just elaborate a little bit more on where we stand today in Europe on AI policy. What, in your opinion, are the key challenges that we face today in that area? And then, more importantly, also, what really is Europe's vision in terms of, leadership in the world? Because it seems to be really the one place where something concrete is happening in this area. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Ayisha, thank you so much for giving me the floor, and for inviting me to this event with excellent co-panelist speakers. So basically in Europe, we've been quite active under the light of the pandemic, and I would say it has been a catalyst to accelerate everything, since we saw already citizens waiting for AI, new technologies to support the work of scientists to develop a vaccine, to develop applications that would help them to be safe, and also teleworking, teleconferences, teleeducation, everything that new technologies can offer to us. Under this light, we have a lot of upcoming legislation, and I worked on the file of the ITRE committee, the industry committee, 2 years ago, saying and directing where AI should lead Europe. But now we are moving more with more concrete steps into having legislative initiatives. And in the end, I'm expecting to have a stronger GDPR that is going to be also binding by law. It will create legal certainty and remove all the fragmentation of the European and digital single market. I will start with an example to show exactly the problem we face in Europe, but not just in Europe, to all the countries that we would like to collaborate with. Firstly, the ECDC is the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, gathering all the data for COVID-19 in Europe from the member states. Almost 80% of data coming from governments, health facilities, and media. The problem was that different legal systems, different languages, different ways to gather this data, different standards led into having quantity of data, but not quality. And we're not fast enough to be able to use those data. So scientists were calling for more quality data. So this is one of the main problems we have to address. And this is also the data governance and the Data Act that it's coming end of this year and the second semester of the next year. This means we have to prioritize and to give more access to data, especially the data that are used for low risk and applications of artificial intelligence, and also more security criteria, but to make possible the access to data also for high risk applications. So this is, for me, essential. Of course, European to have a digital identity. It's really important for Europe since we have different systems, and we have to support technologies that will be interoperable to achieve that. We have to create an ecosystem of talent and excellence in Europe that will be here when we remove all this fragmentation and the barriers we have among us among the member states. And I think since we are now developing also investment tools, the MFF was already agreed. We have tools that will help us face all the sectors that were harmed by the pandemic, everything, of course, but also specifically health, a more concrete health strategy. And the prism now that will, every investment will go through will be digitalization and green innovation, which means suddenly in Europe, you're going to see a lot of investments to go digital. And we are trying also to establish a vibrant ecosystem that will keep excellence in Europe by supporting them in this transition phase to having different business models using new technologies, because we saw in Europe during this pandemic, the most resilient businesses were the ones that were digitalized or innovative. So this is a bit the prism we have, and these are the work. This is the work we are preparing to do, and I can be more specific later into how we want to lead, of course, by translating properly human rights and European values and rule of law in the digital era.
Well, thank you so much, Eva. I think digital governance as well as and the link to that with AI policy is really key. Before we go to the next one, I just wanted to ask, we understand that work has been done on that. What about the timing? Are we, when can we really see something coming out in terms of timing?
So in terms of legislation, you mean?
Yes.
We already have the first 3 reports touching upon liability, ethics, and investments and IP rights, but we are expecting by the end of 21 to also have developed a strategy on the data sets and the Data Act, so the governance of data. The digital innovation hubs where we're mentoring companies, it's already happening. So we are expecting immediately for them to launch. I think they already have in some member states. So you will see we're acting quite fast. And by the end of March, we're expecting an AI ethical framework binding by law. Basically, let's say an enhanced GDPR that we will not just be based, it will not just be a directive, but we will make sure that there will be safeguards for companies through the whole life cycle of AI to prove that they are complying.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thanks for elaborating on that. I'd like to move now to a little bit more specific question. That is really looking at priority areas. So I'll pose this question to the business. So I'll pose it to David, and I would like to have Ivana's view on that. And then I would love to have Robert as well as Eva to sort of give your response. So the question really is, and I'll start with you, David, from a global perspective, what is it that you see as the key priority areas that you would like, regulators to be really focusing on? And obviously, because this is a huge area, so 2 or 3 that are key for you now. And I would like then Ivana to also share from her perspective those 2 areas.
I think that the first and perhaps the most important one is to help us to build trust on the technology, and to help us to be sure that consumer, employees, the society really believe that we are planning to use the technology for the benefit of the society and as well as for the benefit of the company. One of our major concerns, and we can use, for example, the COVID tracking application as an example, is that the lack of trust of the citizen in how my data is going to be used, for what purpose the technology is going to be used. This can be one or the main inhibitor for the adoption of a technology that can save our life. Okay, if this is something that is happening with something that can save your life, imagine with the rest of the technology. I think that there are many big question marks about how my data is going to be used, for what purpose the technology is going to be used, and this can be, an important inhibitor for the technology adoption. The second one, I think that has been already discussed: avoid conflicting prescriptive regulation. I think that we have too many regulators working on their specific area. Privacy side, e-commerce, IT, artificial intelligence. And I think that this regulator has to understand the potential consequences of one piece of regulation in the other areas. Okay. And I think that the third area that also started to be a concern for us is how we can create effective data flows and try to avoid the temptation to impose more data localization requirements. Okay. Artificial intelligence without data, is not useful. Okay, and we have mentioned, the COVID, and as we mentioned many other examples. So we need to use both in combination. So we cannot expect for the artificial intelligence technology to return the invest that we are planning, to obtain for the use of this technology at society level, not just talking about from the company point of view, if we don't facilitate as well these data flows, and we see more and more temptation, to basically protect the data and try to maintain control of the data. And I think that some example has been mentioned. We see regulation almost everywhere. We have the Russian example. We have some data localization requirement in new laws in India, in new laws in Brazil. So if we cannot move the data, of course, in a secure way, of course, in always protecting the right of the individuals, so we will have an important limitation as well, in how we can, how we are planning to use. So build the trust, avoid conflicting prescriptive regulation as much as possible, and enable effective data flows.
Well, thank you. You just summarized what I was going to say. So I hope that Eva and Robert have noted that down. But before we go to the answer there, I go also to Ivana with the same question. From your perspective, what are the key priorities?
Thank you so much. I'll mention 2 things, to be honest. And the first one is, to me, it's really important that in this case, the EU, as we have ever here, outlines very clearly what is the due diligence process that companies need to adhere to when they produce, deploy, and then develop and then deploy a new tool. And the due diligence is very important. And I think companies are after this, because when an organization decides to transform and digitize using artificial intelligence, be it in the back office operation or for digital advertising or for whatever it is, they need to know that there is some due diligence out there, which is really important, and that they have to adhere to. And this goes from the concept of fairness, of transparency, to explainability, to what the data minimization, and all what needs to govern the entire life cycle of the product, from the development to the deployment. This due diligence is really, really important. And I think the real clarity around what this due diligence looks like is crucial. The other thing in relation to due diligence is that when there is a claim of that a company has follow this due diligence, when there is a claim of verifiability or of legibility, for example, of a specific algorithm, how is it possible for the company to demonstrate that this is happening? And this is, I think, where we need some guidance and support. Are there institutional mechanisms, for example? And they could be, for example, auditing and having third-party companies auditing companies to verify that due diligence has been followed. It could be, for example, to have bias and safety bounties. It could be sharing of AI intelligence. So there are different tools from an institutional perspective where, for example, regulators or bodies can really look at whether a company has been following and adhering to the due diligence. And this is the first element that I wanted to bring. The second element is around what is the protection for citizens, data subjects and consumers here. Whether we need a new form of redress that is able to support individuals when, for example, they've been discriminated by automated decisions, and also how are we dealing with new forms of discrimination that may come from automated decisions. And I'm thinking about, for example, discriminations that are much more difficult to understand when they come from automated decisions. I'm thinking when discrimination is intersectional, so somebody being discriminated because it's Black and a woman, how is that going to work and be able to be detected in an automated decision? So basically my 2 points are, one is around citizens and how we safeguard citizens, whether we need new form of redress, whether we need new forms of mandatory transparency that can support individuals to be protected. And the second thing is really about due diligence, having that clarity around due diligence and having the clarity around which institutional and mechanism are we using in order to then verify the claims that organizations are making, that they're processing the tools and the AI products that they deploy and develop are verifiable, interpretable, and accountable to society.
Very well, thank you. So just summarize, I think there are sort of few things we heard, and those are, so it's conflictive regulation. What do we do about that? Trust, for what purpose the tech has to be used? What do we do about that? How do we create effective data flows? And then, of course, the due diligence process, claims, how can we verify them? And of course, the mechanism of redress for consumers if things do go wrong. So now I'd like to hear the response from Eva and Robert. Maybe Robert, you could go first on some of these.
Yes, thanks, Ayisha. So I think those were two great sets of ideas. I think if I can start from the point of view of basic principles. In Europe, the principles that we've been working on are precisely the ones that have just been mentioned. So if you want to do AI as a company, show there's a benefit. And if you want to do AI as a company, ensure transparency. Those are two key factors. And then maintain human autonomy, uphold justice, and do no harm. And against those principles, what companies have been doing so far is applying the standards and reporting to the Commission. We haven't seen the report yet. How has it gone? What happens to you as a company when you take these principles in-house and you try to apply them? And I think that approach of in a way, co-creation of a regulatory benchmark is one possible response. And what you then get is something that the Commission, at least some enlightened parts of the European Commission, call adaptive regulation. So you set some basic standards, not conflicting prescriptive regulation, but standards. And then to pick up the auditing point, people need to report on how it's gone in an auditable way. So that you need a paper trail, you need something that can be checked for need. And the public authorities need to devote resources to monitoring this process. You can't just set standards and cross your fingers. And then you need a deliberative process involving all social actors, not just legislators and executive, in discussing whether the outcomes are good enough. And it's only with that sort of virtuous spiral of adaptive regulation that you can achieve safe launch of new technologies, including AI, without being over prescriptive. The other point I'd like to make is to underline what Ivana said about not reinventing the wheel. In the liability space, for example, I think that in Europe, we've done quite a good job of having real experts in liability look at what more needs to be done in terms of no-fault claims, for example, to begin to move towards a liability that's fit for a highly dynamic, innovative technology such as AI. We haven't yet applied that, but I think that's a very good example of how you can do an update for AI without reinventing the wheel.
Thank you, Robert. That's illuminating. I pass to Eva now. If you have something to say.
Yes, actually, you touched upon the most important issues that we're trying to address. But let me say, because I understand that when we talk about data localization, something that it's protectionism, I have a different understanding. So it depends. We don't have one box that could fit everything. We are trying to separate low risk from high risk applications and make sure that member states will have a say in controlling the data of their citizens and how much of those data will be able to be exchanged or transferred beyond their the national borders. This is why we're also investing into having a strong European cloud option and basically to make sure to create these safeguards that we will be able to control that our data are used only for the specific reasons that were mentioned from each company. So let's say that we will try to have an identity for datasets that will explain why and how those datasets are being used. And of course, this means that, as Robert also said, it has to benefit and explain why they're being used, being transparent, having human control. We call it human-centric AI. This means that once we talk about deep learning and autonomous AI, then suddenly we need to have the right to redress. So we need to have the right to claim that you've been injured or harmed by an AI system, or that you need to go back and have a human to decide that it was a correct answer, a decision or not. This is because AI, we call it artificial intelligence, is not always smarter than people. It can gather lots of data, but the parameters and the actually how you write the algorithm, it's done by humans. So humans make mistakes. You could have biases, you could have exclusion, you could have mistakes. We always have to be able to protect and change the algorithms and basically test it frequently to make sure it follows the rules. So I will also agree that we need to have a rule of a set of standards that we will all be able to follow without stifling innovation. But let me say that these standards will help us gather data, collect data in appropriate manner, and make sure also that we give alternatives and options to citizens on how they're going to control their data. And I will give you here also one example. When you're using your applications for traffic control, you can, in Europe at least, you can say, I'm allowing the application to use my location while using it. Mm-hmm. So when you're not using it, it's off, it's not following you. You don't have the same with your microphone. You cannot switch your microphone on while you're using the app. It's on or off. So it also tracks anything you're saying, and it sends you targeted advertisements. So we're also trying to make sure that citizens are aware of how much control they can and should have on their data. And two contradictions that we have in Europe to face is they always ask us if we should compromise privacy for safety. The contact tracing applications brought this discussion up. And we've decided that we shouldn't compromise anything. We should have both. This is what we will try to achieve. We have to be open, but at the same time, we need to have reciprocity with countries that respect the same values. And this means we have to give control to citizens and make sure that we respect their data and their sensitive data. And I don't call this protectionism. I call it control of Europe for our European values and principles, principle-based legislation. And I think this is our compass at the time being in Europe.
Thank you, Eva. And I think you raise an important point, which will bring me now to my next question, which is, Europe definitely looking at human-centered AI, principle-based AI. You're talking about we will not really compromise. But obviously, when we look at the globe, not everybody is thinking this way. And it's a little bit going backwards also to what we were saying with regards to Europe's role. Because, as everybody has also heard, China is a big player now in AI. They want to be the leader by 2030. I mean, I'm sure Nestlé and some of the other companies that are multinationals are also having businesses over there. And, when we talk about harmonization globally, we cannot ignore sort of differences which exist. So here I would also like to, hear a little bit more on Europe's role and how we can bring this together. And feel free, Ivana, also David, please to jump in with your thoughts and your needs. And I would like Eva and then Robert maybe to elaborate a little bit on that point.
Well, it has also to do with not just the culture, but it has to do with democracies. And I mentioned that before. This is where we need to achieve reciprocity. So we have to have standards where whoever complies will benefit by our collaboration. And Europe is a big market. So I saw that in China, they used the pandemic to control even more citizens, have this like social ranking that it would never be acceptable in Europe. So when you're saying leading, it's maybe economically could happen for some time, but I don't believe not having a democracy could keep you leading on anything for too long. So I would say that we are trying, like GDPR, to set some standards where, based on our perspective, we would be able to collaborate the minimum. I don't talk about the maximum, but definitely respect of privacy and definitely security criteria on what kind of data are being shared among us. So I would also say that at this point, Europe is actually leading in research, and we're investing a lot on new technologies, quantum computing, supercomputers, in several new technologies. So I wouldn't say we will be left behind. I would say it's better late than sorry. So we delay a bit because we want to make sure that AI will complement citizens and people. It will not take control. It will not be used to control by governments that want to control their citizens. It will be used just for the benefit of the society. So in this way, if you would ask somebody that's developing an AI system, if they would go to China or US, maybe they would go to develop something because they have access to any data, or they would go because they have high risk liquidity available in US. But if you want quality of life and you want to know that there is legal certainty and there are human rights translated into digital human rights, then you choose Europe actually to spend the rest of your life. And now that we're taking down the barriers between the member states, I believe that the potential of having a super strong market, a European market, is obvious now more than ever. So I'm quite optimistic about the leadership we want to achieve.
Good, thank you so much. I think we will be opening soon to questions, but David, would you like to comment something on that from a global?
Yeah, something very, just to say that I fully agree with the role that Europe has to play. To be honest, in the privacy area, Europe has been always the lighthouse that many jurisdictions has decided to follow. But I think that we have to try not to make the same mistake that we have made in the past. And using GDPR as a very good example, I think there's a very important piece of regulation that was created with an intention. But in certain ways, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to comply with GDPR, plus all the ways that GDPR has been interpreted, by the different regulators in the European Union. And if this is complex for a big company like Nestlé or like Deloitte, imagine, this level of complexity for the small and medium enterprises, okay? I think that's something that we have to be sure when we are designing the new regulation is something so important, artificial intelligence, especially when you want to be the role model to follow by other jurisdictions. is try to make it simple, easy to comply with, put the focus in what really matters, and try to maintain, as you say, if we want to build one economic space, we want to avoid the, limitation that we have today, try to align as well the interpretation, because talking now as a company who is proud to comply, with all the laws everywhere where we are operating and even go beyond this, sometimes we feel a lot of frustration when something is interpreted in two different opposite directions by regulators that are supposed to be talking each other. Okay, it's just,
thank you.
If you want to, something to say. Yeah.
Robert, do you have something to add? Since sort of you had a big
I
role in the GDPR, so I thought you might want to say something.
I wouldn't claim a big role in GDPR, but I would be very interested just to dig a bit more into the last comment, because one question is a harmonious data set for training your AI. And I think an emerging technological question is whether all the data has to be in the same place for the AI to learn from it. So you could always send your AI to the data. And then the second piece, once you've trained the AI, and this is more interesting, is you deploy instances of your same AI into different jurisdictions, and maybe the data is different, or even the data is the same, but the people are different. And actually then a single, for example, Nestlé AI will grow in different ways in different markets. And personally, I don't think that's a bad thing. That's the neat thing about machine learning. So I while agreeing totally that data flows are crucial, it seems to me that that's a different desirable public goal than having good AI and good AI regulation. So I think to put everything on AI is asking a bit much, would be my comment.
Great, thank you. I know, Ivana, didn't come to you, but I was just thinking, because time is running out, I will be now moving maybe to one or two questions that we have in the chat. So could we basically hear what's going on in the chat?
Microphone. We have two questions from the audience. One is, are ethics norms and policy in different regions important to national AI strategy and policy? And it was seconded by another audience member. And the other question is, what are the 3 key obstacles that prevent harmonization of data quality across EU countries?
Good. 3, so thank you so much. So 3 elements that are stopping data harmonization across EU. Any thoughts on that one? Who'd like to take that?
Maybe if I can go first, Ayisha, I think, and maybe Eva has a comment as well, but I think the real problem here is that even in something as close as the European Union, we have 27 member states and however many lender regions in different countries, and they all have their own rights to legislate. And so the natural obstacle to everything being the same is that there are different jurisdictions. And I think we're going to have to design our way around that, because it's not going to change.
Eva, small comment?
Yes, of course. We have 24 different languages, 27 different legal and tax systems, and different levels of digitalization. So suddenly, with the pandemic, we are trying to move faster forward, with nobody being left behind. But this is not the case. So to harmonize and being interoperable, they all have to be equally mature in several ways. The identity that I mentioned, to have the capacity for supercomputers, we are investing on that too, to create cross-border collaboration. But even in payments, we need to take down a few barriers that are still left to have a real digital single market. And we saw the disruption of supply chains during the beginning of the pandemic. To remove these regulatory obstacles, we have to decide to do that. We have done that. We have achieved that. And trust me, the Parliament is leaving behind what divides us, and we're trying to move very fast. Also the Commission, sometimes we face the problems of the Council, specific countries, that they want to have more control of the data, so to develop their own strategies. But I think that now more than ever, everybody realized that at least we have to achieve a level of harmonization to give access to data together in Europe. And I think we will move very fast to this direction. So nobody else in any case has done something more. I mean, now everybody's developing their strategies on AI. So I don't think we delayed. I think it's happening, but it's more complex to achieve.
Okay. Thank you. So when we go to access to data, and I think that brings me a little bit to the big tech giants. And this is a question, of course, I need to ask because, recently I also saw the Netflix documentary, Social Dilemma. And in there, there are some claims that are being made with regards to the business models of the big tech giants that are using our data, and sometimes leading to unintended consequences, which obviously have grave impact to our society as a whole. So the question I have really is with regards to, is that an area in terms of, regulation that Europe is looking at? That is that something that, because there's one issue is with regards to the business model, the other issue is with regards to their influence. And that one is also something that some people feel is far too much when it comes to, policy making. And the second, and that deals with also another leg to it, which is saying, well, where are the SMEs? What is their role? Is everybody's voice being heard in this arena? So I'd like to, and in fact, I would love to have everybody's opinion on that, because I think it's something that is quite, it's a debate that is often talked about. So who would like to start? Eva, you can go first, and then I'd like to hear also, in fact, Ivana also on that.
Yeah, I don't want to abuse the time that you're giving me, but definitely we're trying to protect innovative companies, as I said before, to support them to become more innovative in their business model. So we have the digital innovation hubs. We're trying to give them more access to data and financing, and of course to protect them from aggressive takeovers from the big companies, because these companies grew when still the understanding of how the value of data is being measured was not a realization for politicians. So we were not trying to rush. We let innovation happen, and now we are understanding we need to have regulations out there in order to achieve to avoid actually having full control in big companies. So we're going to have an update of the traditional laws, the competition law. We try to redefine it, because we see now companies like Uber, they don't own cars, but they have a huge role to play in transportation. We have Airbnb, they don't own hotels, but they have played a big role in the tourism. But this, similar to that, if I can make a comparison, a company doesn't need to abuse and to abuse the traditional laws, but if they control a lot of data, they can actually, as you said, manipulate perceptions, and they can become a threat to our democracy. So we need to do something about those. So we need to modernize our traditional laws in order to cover and make sure we will safeguard our political systems from anyone that is trying to attack it, because we don't even talk about deep fakes. I mean, there could be a video of me saying crazy things, and not even a developer can understand if it's fake or not, just the day before elections. So we have to make sure we will protect our system, and this is not protectionism. So I'm very careful when I use this word, but we definitely need to set a clear rules out there.
Thank you so much. And before I go to Robert after, I would like to go to Ivana. Ivana, do you have something to add on Social Dilemma? And what kind of claims on in terms of the power of the tech giants?
Thank you. So in terms of the social dilemma, I think it was important, the fact that such issues becoming mainstream at the moment. And that is something that is fairly new, although I have some serious criticism of the social dilemma, because it blanked a lot of the voices, especially women and especially Black women, who have been driving the debate around ethics, and they were not appearing in that film. But anyway, apart from that, the good thing about the social dilemma and others is that I think it showcasing that people, citizens, consumers are waking up to the politics and geopolitics of data. And they're waking up to the fact that data is not neutral, and they're waking up to the fact that technology is not neutral either, that a technological artifact is in reality a techno-social product. And I think people are waking up to this, and this is important and leads me to what Eva was talking about. I think we, in the UK, not long ago, we had an experience with the A-levels, which are the exams in the UK for students. And what happened is that because students couldn't go to school because of the virus, the algorithms were tasked with giving the students grades. And what happened is that students coming from state education were graded worse than students coming from private education. And that's yet another example of the sort of the potential discrimination that comes with algorithms that are increasingly having an editorial function, a curation function, and as Eva was saying, to an extent also creating a reality for individuals. If you look, for example, of algorithms deciding which news we are going to be served when we browse the internet. So this is very new in terms of the digital ecosystem. This is where it's really important to update the current legislation that we've got. So for example, when it comes to consumer legislation, how is algorithmic driven pricing going to impact on citizens' rights and consumers' rights when compared to traditional pricing toolings that were in place? So it's really important, I think, to look at the current legislation and say, is that enough to safeguard us from these potentially new harms? Yeah. One last thing that I wanted to say, and then I'm shut up from it, is around the data flows. And I think we are in a little bit of a dilemma here, and I will be delighted to talk with Eva much further about this. And the dilemma, I think, is around what is the relationship between protectionism and data protection. And I think there is a little bit of confusion around this too, but this is a very sort of separate topic, which I would love to discuss at some point.
Thank you. I mean, we're going to continue later on also in a coffee, so please do so, virtual coffee, of course. Robert, one line, if anything to add there before I open the floor next to the questions we have in the chat.
So yes, going back to your initial question, Ayisha, I think that one thing that's great about AI is people are revisiting issues that they didn't care enough about, like justice and bias and unintended consequences. The second thing is that the whole paradigm of responsible innovation or open innovation actually requires the people who don't know anything to be at the table. And AI experts have a huge problem accepting a repeatedly proven fact that the man and woman in the street, the people who don't understand, if you frame the questions in the right way, they can give you very challenging but helpful guidance. And so opening up to everybody is a crucial success factor for those engaged in data and tech innovation.
Great. Thank you. So with that, I'd just like to ask once again, Adriana, do we have any further questions? I see some. Maybe you'd like to summarize. We have still about 7-8 minutes to go for our panel discussion.
That should be enough. Nicholas Grunder asked to hear Eva and Robert's view on regulation or non-regulation of industrial AI, where many concerns about risk to individuals do not apply or apply in a limited way only. And that will be the only question that we have had since my last intervention. Over to you.
Thank you. Who would like to start?
Well, maybe I can
go first. Maybe Robert, yeah.
Nicholas and I have been having a private chat where he makes clear that what he means is that at least the data in industrial AI is just raw machine data processed in the factory. Okay. Or used in a central cloud. And I think that my expectation is that the rules which the Commission may propose will apply where there are risks. So something in closed use by a proprietor will not itself be regulated, although maybe the risks generated downstream, the proprietor will still be liable. So I think that's the first thing I'd say. The bad news is I think that it's a very insecure way of regulating to regulate by current use, because uses can evolve. So I think if I were developing an industrial AI, I might want to make sure that it's fit for purpose for other deployments later, even if I can escape regulation today.
Very well. Eva, anything to add?
Yes, of course, I think there has to be regulation. And as I said before, the low risk, high risk and per sector approach, I think will clear a bit the air on what's happening and how industry can use those data. But we also want to leave access to new companies, to startups and SMEs. So we have to make sure we will understand not just how they use data, but also to be able up to a level to share those data and allow innovation to happen. And as for how we're going to do that, we're having the data governance to clarify a bit how we're going to proceed. And as I said again, I don't think protecting and explaining how you use data it's gonna create any friction or any will stifle innovation. I think it's gonna give us more clear understanding on the liabilities. 2 years ago, a colleague suggested that liable if an accident happened in autonomous vehicles should be the car. Well, it should not be the vehicle. It has to be the manufacturer or the guy who designed the software, or the ones who did not test it, or us regulators who did not call for more testing and more safeguards. So we have to clarify a bit how liability will be translated into the digital era. So I think if we manage to do that, then we will see a strong European industrial strategy. We already tabled the vision we had at an initiative report, and we have already a specific window for industrial strategy and more financing in sectors that they are directly harmed or connected to the pandemic, and how they actually suffered during this pandemic. So I think you're going to see a lot of news and results coming out from the Parliament and the Commission in the next year.
Super, looking forward to that. While we wait for more questions to come in, I've got one related to multilateral institutions, and this one goes to, I'll start with David first, because, I remember having some conversations about that. I mean, here we understand, of course, they've got UNESCO, OECD, ITU, European Union as well, many that are actually working on, this topic. The question is, and it's very simple, if you were to rate them out of 10, David, how well do you think they're doing? And then I would like to hear from the panel if you have suggestions, each of you, for what can be really improved. So
I have to say,
sorry to put you on the spot there, David.
No problem. You know me, I'm not very political correct when I receive this kind of question. So I have to say that my personal feeling, and based on what we have discussed today, they are not doing a very good job, because what we see today is still a very regional, approach. We see what is happening in the US, what is happening in China, what's happening in India, what's happening in Europe, but we don't see, any kind of strong, multinational movement, and the role of this kind of organization, I think that will be key, because again, there are many potential use of artificial intelligence. Some of them will benefit to all of us, pandemic and the COVID, but there are many other examples. So I think that for these special cases, perhaps not for each and every potential use of this technology, but for few of these cases, for the benefit of the individual, we have talked about, international campaigns, or how can interface democracy in other countries. Sometimes we are claiming against the role of the big platform, but at the end of the day, who are behind these campaigns? What are the role of the governance? How active you can be, making a finger point exercise that these kind of campaigns are coming from this and this country, how the rest of the world can protect against that. So it's very easy to claim, and it's easy to put the responsibility in some of the players, but at the end of the day, how we are protecting ourselves, against this kind of, international, intent to influence the democracy in the rest of the world.
Good. So I'm just going to give about 1 minute each to maybe starting with Ivana. Any suggestions how this can be improved? Because obviously we need that in order to come up with a harmonized approach. So any suggestions for multilateral institutions based out of Geneva, Paris, and the others? Maybe Ivana. Then we.
I think there are some interesting things happening. So, for example, the Council of Europe is now set up a specific ad hoc committee on AI, with the idea of creating binding legislation. And I wouldn't underestimate the power of the Council of Europe, which is bigger than Europe and has got a lot of members in it. So in a big reach. I had the pleasure to be part in the UNESCO conference in Beijing on the use of artificial intelligence in education. And I have to say that, yes, although there is a lot of discussions and still a lot of difficulties to understand how we turn ethics into practice, I do think that there is something valuable, immensely valuable in these conversations happening at global level, which I would encourage. And I think they're really important because you get together countries' ministers from across the globe to find a shared approach to ethics. The problem is how you turn this into practice.
Reality.
And let's not, and that's the next step. And this is why sort of regulation is important, different tools, institutional mechanisms, software mechanisms, whatever is needed is important. But I think those elements of discussions and exchange are very crucial.
Super. Well, thank you. I'm wary of the fact that we've sort of just running out of time now. So any last words for Robert and Eva? And then just for our audience, I'm sorry if we haven't been able to take all the questions, but we will be moving afterwards to a separate session where we can still go on with the discussion. So some last words, Eva and Robert, and even David, if you want something to say.
I can just mention an initiative we took. So under my Science and Technology Committee in the Parliament, we created the Center for AI to collaborate with OECD, UN, IEEE, the Standards Organization, in order to work together, not duplicate or overlap, into agreeing what are the standards that we can actually use and that we could use and expand beyond EU. So I think this is one of the initiatives we are trying to have, and there is a big roundtable taking place with IEEE and UN and us now into understanding a bit better the definitions that we agree on, because we don't even have a common definition for AI. So let's start from there, and then let's move into setting some common global standards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Robert, any last words?
Yeah, so I think that this conversation really demonstrates that global regulatory cooperation requires a sustained conversation with everybody and not just the regulators. And I think that's something that regulators should bear in mind.
Very good, thank you. David, anything else to add?
No, I think that, yeah, the final comment, I fully agree with Robert. I think that at the end of the day, it's not just a regulator working alone, even in their own jurisdiction on their territories, taking into account the other, point of view and participating and making a joint exercise. But we need a common regulation here. So the balkanization of the regulation will be a strong inhibitor for the innovation and for the adoption of the technology that I fully agree with Eva is going to be key for the future of the economy in Europe and beyond Europe, of course.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. I think it was a fantastic discussion. As I said, we can move we will be moving the discussion into a chat. I think you will have a link displayed now on where you can go in. That's the place you can go in. It's just there, I see. For those of you who will not be joining us for that, we're going to be taking a coffee break. And at 3:30, we'll be starting with the next panel, which is about AI policy in healthcare. So do stay with us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure. I think it was such a great debate. And for those of you who are joining us, please come in and give us another 10 minutes of your time if anybody wants to discuss any further. All right. Bye-bye from now, and I'll see you in the coffee break.
Thank you for the wonderful moderation. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.